One time there was a man who was lost, and he goes up to two policemen who he did not know only spoke Czech, and he asks them for directions in English. And the policemen just look at him, and they don't really understand. So he asks them again in German, and they still don't understand. So he asks again in Spanish, and then again in French, and they still didn't understand, so he just gave up and walked away. So the one policeman said to the other policeman, "We should probably learn another language, huh?" And the other policeman says, "Why? That guy knew 4 and it didn't help him." So today we'll explore the different dimensions of cross-cultural communication. And language can be a funny thing. Sometimes it can be entertaining and other times it can be frustrating. But one of the first things that we should explore is the underlying factors of communication. And those are the understanding of the culture as well as the worldview. So for successful cross-cultural communication, you should first have a good understanding of the culture that you're coming from as well as the culture that is receiving you. You should understand how that culture was developed, the different aspects of their history that affects the way they think and why they do the things they do. You should understand the strengths and weaknesses of your own culture as well as their culture. And that way you can be more aware of the things that you should be cautious of, how you act. Because if you're not aware that you're weak in these areas, then it could cause confusion in communication. And then as far as worldview, each culture has their own set of ethical bylaws or a system of morality that as a culture they've decided or been taught. And so these things can influence what is permissible in this culture and what is not permissible in this culture. And so knowing these things are important to know how to go about interacting with the people. And finally, perception. And perception is how these people perceive the world around them. An example of this would be if 2 men were looking out of the same window and they were asked what they see. The one man says, "I see mud," while the other one says, "I see a beautiful sky." This is a difference in perception. So each culture perceives the world around them in a different way. There's an idea of linguistic relativism. This is the idea that the choice of words or the language that the people speak actually shapes the way they perceive the world around them. So all these things are important for understanding if you want to communicate cross-culturally successfully. So other than the underlying and nonverbal aspects of cross-cultural communication, there are also verbal aspects. If you could think of, for example, a high context or a low context culture, it's important to know is the culture you're going to high or low context. American culture is an example of a low context culture. They use verbal communication to express their thoughts and their feelings, and they value being blunt and straight to the point. Where a high context culture would be an example like the Philippines. They value the verbal interaction as a way to keep social harmony. So they wouldn't value directness, but rather to do anything to make sure that people are getting along. So this is important when you're approaching people to know how direct or indirect you should be in your verbal or spoken language. Another verbal factor is formality versus informality. Is the culture, do they have a form of verbal formality? In English, we address people with the same set of vocabulary, whether we know them or we don't. It's dependent on the way we approach them, our tone of voice, that type of thing, whether it's formal or informal. In many languages, such as Czech or even Spanish, they have actual formal tenses on how to greet people who are older than you or who have higher stature than you or who you don't know. So it's important to have, if you want to have respectful and successful verbal communication with those around you, to understand, is this culture a formal or informal culture, or do these different features of spoken language have a place in this culture's set of communication? So finally, when you know the underlying factors as well as the verbal factors of communicating in the culture, you can then foster an effective environment in which to share the gospel cross-culturally. The different communication factors in sharing the gospel cross-culturally that you should pay attention to are contextualization and building effective relationships. Contextualization generally includes the first set of underlying factors that we discussed. It talks about knowing the people's history. It talks about contextualization is building a bridge from their set of ethics and values and worldview to Christian ethics and values and worldview. So to communicate the gospel to them, you should understand these things and connect them to a Christian sense. And you should also understand their perception and how they perceive the world in order to understand how they will take the gospel in. Which way can you present it that it will make the most sense to them or speak the loudest to them? Finally, building relationships in order to share the gospel. This part shows importance to the verbal factors of communication. You should be able to know how to respectfully approach the people. You should know, for example, if they're indirect or direct, how will they best respond to the relationships that you're building with them? What is the most effective way to approach them? And each culture is unique in this manner, and therefore sharing the gospel in each culture is also unique. So, in conclusion, our 3 points were the underlying factors, understanding the culture that is receiving you, as well as understanding the culture that's sending you. And then finally, we have the verbal factors, informal versus formal, or direct, indirect type culture, and then how these two work together to communicate the gospel successfully. So once we have understood these things, we can then carry out Matthew 28 and go make disciples of all nations.
Very good. That's correct.